The sky over occupied France, summer of 1944. A German Messerschmitt pilot banks his fighter through broken cloud, scanning the horizon with the tired vigilance of a man who's seen too many friends disappear into smoke. Above him, maybe 20,000 feet up, he spots them, American fighters, silhouette against the white glare. P-47 Thunderbolts. He knows the shape. Everyone does. Fat. Ungainly. The jokes write themselves in Luftwaffe ready rooms, flying bathtubs, American refrigerators with propellers, iron stoves that somehow got airborne. He watches one Thunderbolt separate from the formation. It seems almost lazy at first, a gentle roll, nose tipping forward. Then gravity takes hold, and what happens next defies everything he's learned about aerial combat. The P-47 doesn't descend, it plummets. The engine note shifts from a steady drone to a howling scream as the massive radial fighter accelerates into a near-vertical dive, transforming from lumbering giant to streaking projectile in seconds. The air itself seems to tear as the Thunderbolt builds speed, 400 miles per hour, 450, 500, 550. The Messerschmitt pilot has maybe 3 seconds to make a decision. Every instinct screams dive away, but he's heard the stories. He's read the loss reports. German fighters that tried to follow these bricks into their terminal dives found their wings flutter, their control surfaces freeze, their airframes beginning to disintegrate as they crossed speeds their elegant, lightweight designs were never meant to endure. The P-47 keeps coming, now a grey meteor with American stars, falling with the kind of purpose that makes your mouth go dry. 850 caliber machine guns. 7 tons of aircraft. Physics weaponized into something that shouldn't work but does, with terrifying efficiency. The German pilot brakes hard left, pulling until his vision tunnels and his ribs ache against the harness. Behind him, the Thunderbolt pulls out of its dive with a force that would have ripped the wings off his Messerschmitt, levels off, and climbs away like nothing happened. Like it was designed to do exactly that. Every single time. This is the moment, repeated in 1,000 different skies across Europe, when Luftwaffe pilots stopped laughing. The joke was over. The punchline had arrived at 600 miles per hour, and it was written in tracer fire and shattered assumptions. That overweight American brick, that flying boiler, that thing they said was too heavy to fight? It was falling on them. And there was nowhere to hide. The mockery started before the first P-47s ever crossed the Atlantic. In German intelligence briefings throughout 1943, the Thunderbolt was described with something approaching contempt. Luftwaffe pilots gathered around reconnaissance photos and captured technical documents, shaking their heads at what American industry had produced. Nearly 8 tons at maximum weight. A radial engine so massive it required a fuselage the size of a small rail car. The thing looked pregnant with its own excess, bulbous nose, thick wings, a cockpit that sat so far back the pilot looked like an afterthought. Die Amerikaner haben einen Panzer im IT Flügeln gebaut, they'd joke. The Americans have built a tank with wings. In ready rooms from Abbeville to Berlin, the P-47 became shorthand for American industrial overconfidence, a nation that thought it could solve the delicate physics of aerial combat by simply adding more metal, more fuel, more guns, more weight. European fighter design had evolved toward refinement, sleek Spitfires, angular Focke-Wulfs, the Messerschmitt's clean lines. These were instruments of precision, balanced on the edge of power and maneuverability. Then America showed up with what looked like a flying foundry. But the Germans weren't alone in their skepticism. American pilots themselves wrote letters home describing their new mount with barely concealed frustration. It climbed like a freight elevator. In a turning dogfight at low altitude, a good pilot in a Focke-Wulf 190 could fly circles around it, literally. The P-47 needed altitude, needed speed, needed room to work. Give it anything less, and it handled like exactly what it was, 7 tons of aircraft trying to pretend it could dance. Republic Aviation's design looked less like a fighter and more like someone had decided to see how much airplane could be hung on a single engine. The result was an aircraft that seemed to violate the basic principles everyone understood about air combat. Light was fast. Nimble was deadly. Heavy was doomed. The Thunderbolt was the heaviest single-engine fighter in the war, by a substantial margin. On paper, in theory, in every conversation that mattered, it should have been a disaster, a cautionary tale about what happens when engineers forget that fighters are supposed to fight, not just survive. The Luftwaffe looked at the P-47 and saw confirmation of everything they believed about American aviation, capable of impressive production, utterly lacking in finesse. They would learn, airframe by shattered airframe, how catastrophically wrong that assessment was. At the heart of every Thunderbolt sat 18 cylinders of American mechanical philosophy, arranged in 2 rows of 9 around a central crankcase. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP. 2,800 cubic inches of displacement. 2,000 horsepower at war emergency power. And a design principle that would have seemed insane to European engineers: embrace the weight. Inside Pratt & Whitney's Connecticut facilities, engineers weren't trying to build a lightweight power plant. They were building something that could absorb punishment, maintain power, and keep running when everything else failed. The RS-2800 was overbuilt to the point of seeming excess, forged components where castings might do, redundant oil lines, cylinders that could lose fins to flak and keep firing. This wasn't delicate engineering. This was industrial warfare translated into metal. That philosophy cascaded through the entire P-47 design. Republic Aviation's engineers, led by Alexander Kartveli, looked at the R-2800's bulk and made a choice that would define everything that followed: they wouldn't fight the weight. They'd use it. The massive engine required a massive cowling. Fine, that cowling could house additional fuel capacity and protective armor. The heavy engine needed a robust firewall and mounting structure. Perfect, that structure could support 8 wing-mounted machine guns and their ammunition feeds. The weight was growing, but so was capability. Every addition made the P-47 less like a traditional fighter and more like a flying fortress built for one. Armor plate behind the pilot's seat, thick enough to stop 20mm cannon shells. Self-sealing fuel tanks that could take hits and keep feeding the engine. A turbo-supercharger system that allowed the R-2800 to maintain power at altitudes where other fighters gasped for oxygen. The Thunderbolt wasn't designed to dodge death, it was designed to absorb it and keep fighting. But here's where physics became an unexpected ally. That 7-ton mass, once in motion, carried momentum that lighter aircraft simply couldn't match. In level flight, yes, it was a disadvantage. But introduce gravity to the equation, point that nose down and let the R-2800 add power to acceleration, and suddenly mass became velocity in a way that terrified anyone watching from below. Kartveli and his team understood something that wouldn't become obvious until combat proved it: in 3-dimensional warfare, the vertical axis mattered as much as horizontal maneuverability. A Spitfire could outturn you. A Messerschmitt could outclimb you from sea level. But nothing in the Luftwaffe inventory could follow a Thunderbolt through a power dive and survive the attempt. The very weight that made it vulnerable in a turning fight made it invincible in a vertical one. The I-2800 didn't just power the P-47. It weaponized mass itself, turning physics from obstacle into advantage. The Germans had built fighters. America had built a kinetic hammer that happened to have wings. The revelation didn't come from engineering theory or wind tunnel data. It came from desperation at 25,000 feet over Germany, when a young pilot named Robert Johnson found himself on the wrong end of a Focke-Wulf 190's guns and made the only choice his training and instincts allowed: he pointed his Thunderbolt straight down and shoved the throttle forward. What happened next would be repeated, studied, refined, and ultimately become the Thunderbolt's signature killing technique. The P-47 didn't just dive, it accelerated in ways that seemed to violate common sense. 400 miles per hour. 450. 500. The airframe shook, the controls stiffened, but nothing broke. Nothing tore. The wings stayed attached. Behind him, Johnson glanced back to see his pursuer pulling out, unable to follow, the Focke-Wulf's lighter airframe beginning to flutter as it approached speeds its designers never intended. Pilots started comparing notes. The stories were consistent: engage at altitude, force the fight vertical, dive like your life depends on it, because it does, and watch your opponent face an impossible choice. Follow and risk structural failure, or break off and watch you escape. Either way, the Thunderbolt survived. Engineers ran the numbers afterward and found something remarkable. The P-47 had been tested to 6.5 G-forces in recovery from dives. Its thick wings, designed to handle the stress of that massive weight, distributed loads in ways that lighter, thinner European designs couldn't match. The turbo-supercharger system kept feeding the engine even in dives that would starve a conventional carburetor. Every structural choice that made the Thunderbolt heavy also made it nearly indestructible when gravity became a weapon. Squadrons began teaching the technique deliberately. Altitude was life. Height was potential energy waiting to be converted into speed, into shock, into sudden violence from above. P-47 groups would climb laboriously, yes, burning fuel and time, to patrol altitudes of 28, 30, even 32,000 feet. German fighters rarely operated that high. They didn't need to. Until Thunderbolt started using that altitude like a loaded spring. The boom and zoom tactic became doctrine: identify targets below, position the sun at your back, roll inverted, and fall. Not dive, fall. Let physics do the work. The RS-2800 screaming, the airframe groaning but holding, the gun sight settling on a target that has maybe 2 seconds to realize what's happening before 850 caliber machine guns open fire from a platform doing 550 miles per hour. What terrified the enemy most wasn't the speed itself. It was the certainty. A Thunderbolt could enter that dive knowing it would pull out intact. German pilots entered those same dives gambling with their lives. The P-47 had turned weight from weakness into certainty. And in aerial combat, certainty is deadlier than speed. The paperwork told a story that Luftwaffe commanders didn't want to read. After-action reports from WWII units throughout occupied Europe began showing patterns that defied their understanding of air combat. Experienced pilots, men with multiple kills, men who'd survived years of Eastern Front brutality, were simply disappearing. No radio calls. No witnesses. Just empty spaces in formations and aircraft that never returned to base. The reports that did come back described something new, something outside the established rules of engagement. Enemy aircraft observed at extreme altitude, one Staffelkapitän wrote. Attack came from directly above, vertical approach, estimate speed in excess of 900 km per hour. Lieutenant Hoffmann attempted evasive dive, aircraft observed breaking up at approximately 4,000 meters. Another report, this one from a bomber escort mission over France, Amerikanische Thunderbolts achieved positional advantage through superior altitude. Subsequent attacks were not horizontal engagements but vertical interceptions. Our fighters could not maintain pursuit geometry. 3 aircraft lost. Cause: structural failure during high-speed defensive maneuvers. Read between the military formality, and the message was clear: they were being hunted from above by something that could dive faster, pull out harder, and repeat the process until either the Thunderbolts ran out of ammunition or the Germans ran out of airplanes. The tactics that had worked against Spitfires and earlier American fighters, force them low, turn the fight horizontal, leverage the Focke-Wulf's roll rate, were suicide against P-47s. The moment you committed to pursuing a diving Thunderbolt, you entered a race your aircraft couldn't win. Some Luftwaffe pilots tried matching them. The wreckage told that story too. Focke-Wulf 190s found scattered across French countryside with wings that had failed in flutter, control surfaces torn away by airflow forces they weren't designed to handle. Messerschmitt 109s with cracked fuselages where the stress of high-speed pullouts had exceeded structural limits. These were good aircraft, proven designs. But they'd been optimized for a different kind of war, one where fights happened in a narrower envelope of speed and altitude. By mid-1944, Luftwaffe intelligence was distributing updated tactical guidance: avoid engagement with P-47s above 6,000 meters unless positional advantage is overwhelming. Do not pursue Thunderbolts in dives exceeding 700 km per hour. Break off attacks if enemy initiates vertical separation. It was advice born of necessity, written in the language of survival rather than victory. The irony would have been funny if it weren't written in blood. The aircraft the Germans had mocked as too heavy to be a threat had become the one thing they most needed to avoid. The brick wasn't falling out of the sky on them by accident. It was falling with purpose, with doctrine, with 7 tons of American engineering that had learned to make gravity into the most reliable weapon in the European theater. But the real nightmare for Germany wasn't happening at 20,000 feet. It was happening at 20 feet, in the terrifying seconds between when someone spotted the silhouette and when the world exploded. Jabbo they called them, short for Jag Bomber, fighter bomber, and by 1944 the word was spoken with the kind of fear usually reserved for artillery barrages and tank assaults. P-47 Thunderbolts, having proven themselves lethal in air-to-air combat, were now being unleashed on everything that moved on the ground. And what moved in Nazi Germany, trains, trucks, staff cars, supply columns, anything with wheels or rails, was suddenly and violently vulnerable. The P-47 was obscenely good at this work. That same structural strength that allowed terminal velocity dives also allowed it to carry ordnance that would have grounded lighter fighters. 2,000 pounds of bombs. 10 5-inch rockets. Or just the 850 caliber machine guns and enough ammunition to turn 3 miles of railroad track into modern art. Pilots would come in low, terrifyingly low, and German troops on the ground learned that the sound of a Pratt & Whitney R2800 at full throttle meant you had seconds to find cover or become a statistic. Rail lines were favorite targets. The industrial arteries that kept the Wehrmacht supplied, the tracks that moved everything from ammunition to replacement troops, became killing grounds. Thunderbolt squadrons would work over a rail yard methodically, first pass to crater the tracks, second pass for the locomotives, third pass for anything that looked important or was trying to hide. The gun camera footage shows it with clinical precision, steam engines torn apart by 50 caliber API rounds, freight cars erupting as ammunition loads cooked off, twisted rails hanging in the air like the aftermath of some industrial apocalypse. Convoys learned to move only at night, and even that wasn't safety. Road columns would suddenly find themselves under attack from thunderbolts that appeared out of the dawn haze, orbiting above like mechanized birds of prey, taking turns diving in to shred anything on wheels. German soldiers interviewed after the war remembered the sound more than anything, that distinctive radial engine growl growing louder, closer, the brief roar of machine gun fire, then the engine fading as the Thunderbolt pulled up and circled around for another pass. The aircraft they joked was too fat to fight was now so feared on the ground that German troops called them Himmelschrecken, sky terrors. The brick had learned to fall. Now it had learned to hunt. Strip away the mythology and look at what the numbers actually said. Performance comparison charts from 1944 tell a story that's more complex and more interesting than simple superiority. The Focke-Wulf 190 and the P-47 Thunderbolt weren't fighting in some abstract realm where specifications determined outcomes. They were fighting in the messy reality of altitude bands, energy states, and tactical positioning. At 10,000 feet and below, advantage, Focke-Wulf. Categorically. The German fighter could outturn the P-47 by a significant margin, outroll it, and in many cases accelerate faster in level flight. A good FW-190 pilot who caught a Thunderbolt slow and low was looking at a kill. The P-47's response rate was sluggish, its turn radius measured in what felt like city blocks. Every American pilot knew this. Training emphasized it: don't get slow, don't get low, don't try to turn with a 190 because you'll lose and you'll die. But warfare isn't conducted in ideal circumstances. Move that same fight to 25,000 feet, and the equation inverted. The P-47's turbo-supercharger kept the R-2800 producing power at altitudes where the FW-190's performance began falling off dramatically. The German fighter's rate of climb degraded, its speed advantage disappeared, and suddenly the Thunderbolt was the faster aircraft with better high-altitude performance. More critically, durability. Examine loss reports from both sides and a pattern emerges. P-47s came home with damage that should have been fatal. Engine cylinders shot away, still flying. Sections of wing missing, still controllable. Fuselage peppered with cannon holes, pilot walked away. The Thunderbolt could absorb punishment that would have made a FW-190 a smoking crater. That armor plate, those self-sealing tanks, that overbuilt structure, all the weight the Germans mocked, meant American pilots survived fights that should have killed them. Then there's the dive performance, which wasn't just an advantage but a complete inversion of vulnerability. In any engagement where a P-47 pilot could choose to extend vertically, diving away at speeds the FW-190 couldn't safely match, the Germans' theoretical turning advantage became irrelevant. You can't shoot what you can't catch, and you can't catch what will kill you to pursue. The kill-loss ratios reflected this tactical reality. By late 1944, P-47 units were posting numbers that should have been impossible for an aircraft this heavy, roughly 2 to 3 kills for every Thunderbolt lost in air combat. Not because it was better in some absolute sense, but because American pilots had learned to fight in the envelope where 7 tons of aircraft became an asset rather than a liability. The FW-190 remained a deadly opponent. Excellent German pilots in favorable circumstances still won engagements. But favorable circumstances were becoming rare, and the Thunderbolt's operational ceiling was higher in both literal and metaphorical senses. There's a photograph from late 1945, taken at a scrapyard in France. Rows of P-47 Thunderbolts being cut up for salvage, their war over, their purpose served. Looking at those images now, it's hard to reconcile what they were with what people expected them to be. The joke seemed distant now, absurd even. Too heavy to fight. A flying brick. American industrial excess with wings. The final accounting tells a different story. 15,636 P-47 Thunderbolts built. More than 3,700 Luftwaffe aircraft destroyed in air-to-air combat. Countless thousands more destroyed on the ground. Losses? Heavy, yes, but survivable. Pilots walked away from crashes that should have been obituaries. Aircraft returned to base with battle damage that should have guaranteed a funeral. The weight they mocked was also the armor that saved lives. German pilots, interviewed decades after the war, spoke about the Thunderbolt with something between respect and residual fear. We learned to recognize the silhouette, one former Jagd Flieger remembered. If you saw them above you, the fight was already decided. They would come down, and there was nothing you could do. Another, more bitter, they called it a fat fighter. It was fat with fuel, fat with ammunition, fat with armor. We were efficient. They were excessive. But excess wins wars. The P-47's combat record isn't just impressive, it's definitional. It proved that fighter design wasn't just about minimizing weight or maximizing agility. Sometimes the answer was more power, more protection, more ammunition, more capability to absorb damage and continue fighting. Republic Aviation had built an aircraft that violated conventional wisdom and emerged as one of the war's most effective fighters precisely because it refused to compromise. The Thunderbolt's pilots loved it eventually, even if they'd complained at first. They loved that it brought them home. They loved that it could take punishment. They loved that when they dove on an enemy, they knew, absolutely knew, their aircraft would survive the maneuver. Certainty in combat is rarer than courage, and more valuable. Somewhere in the occupied Europe of 1943, Luftwaffe pilots laughed at reconnaissance photos of America's new fighter. They joked about its bulk, its ungainly proportions, its apparent disregard for the elegant principles of aerial combat. The laughter lasted maybe 6 months. Then the Thunderbolts arrived in force, climbed to altitude, and began falling like mechanized meteors on anyone unfortunate enough to be underneath them. The brick wasn't a mistake. It was a philosophy. It was American engineering solving a problem by adding mass and power until the problem stopped existing. And for thousands of German pilots looking up in the spring of 1944, watching that fat fighter begin its dive, it was the last thing they ever saw. The fat fighter that couldn't possibly work had become the meteor they couldn't escape. The joke had turned lethal. The brick had learned to fall. And fall it did, with terminal, unstoppable vengeance.